In this video, I'm going to show how to do some simple testing scenarios using ASP.NET Core. The twist that this video has is that I'm going to be using the cross-platform tools, namely Visual Studio Code with the C# extension installed, the .NET CLI, and these tools will work even though I'm showing how to use this on a Mac. These tools will work across Windows and Linux as well. So to get started, I'm going to open up the integrated terminal inside of Visual Studio Code, and I'm here in my development directory for .NET Core apps, and I'm going to create a new directory to store the solution, which will contain the individual products. I'm going to call this Core Store because it's going to be an e-commerce application. And then I'll change to that directory. And now what I'll do is I'm going to add two projects to this directory. I'm going to add a web project, an empty ASP.NET web application, and then I'm going to add a test project. First, I'm going to do the web project. .NET new, using the web template, and I'm going to call it corestore.web. And once it's done, I'm going to open up Core Store in the editor. Okay, now what this is going to do in a few seconds here, this is going to prompt me to add some build and debug assets. And I'm going to go ahead and allow that. And what it's going to do is it's going to configure Visual Studio Code to be able to build and debug this corestore.web project from within the editor. If I had gone ahead and added the tests before I did this, there's a possibility that it might pick up the wrong project and try to configure the tests to be run and debugged and built from inside of the Visual Studio Code editor. So that's why I went ahead and did this now. And if I look inside here, I'll see I've got two JSON files. This tasks here, which just defines the build, but notice that everything here is configured to use the Core Store web project and not the test project. And here again, we're using Core Store web. All right. Now I can go ahead and go back to the integrated terminal, and I can add the test project. So again, I'll do .NET new. And this time I can use, for the test project, I can use either mstest or xunit. Both will get the job done. I'm going to use xunit because I'm on this cross-platform theme, and xunit has a history of being cross-platform, whereas mstest, even though now it works cross-platform, has a history of being Windows. So xunit-o core store tests. Alright, and now with this done, there's one more thing that I need to do to get everything sort of pre-configured before we actually start to write some code. And that is I need to add a reference to the test project for the web project, because we're going to be testing the code in the web project. So I'm going to change to the directory for the test project. And then what I'll do is I'm going to add a reference to the web project using the .NET CLI. So we'll do .NET add reference, and then I need to give it a path to the project file for the corestore.web project. So that'll be up one directory, corestore.web, and then there's the web project, csproj. If I open up that test project csproj file now, you can see that there's a reference to the Core Store web project. Okay. One more thing that needs to be done here, and this is kind of odd, but right now if I were to start writing code for the test project, it would not give me any IntelliSense for the types inside of the web project. Not sure why this happens at this point, but all I know is that the solution is very simple, and that's just to restart Visual Studio Code or reload it. And I can do that with Command-Shift-P, Control-Shift-P on Windows to open up the command palette, and then type reload. You can see I've used this command quite a bit, and then just select reload window, The editor will reload, and we're ready to continue. Before I can write any tests, I have to have some code to test against, and I'll do that over here in the corestore.web project. Now, the empty ASP.NET Web application template, all it does is generates a very simple project that will only print the text "Hello World" to the browser, or rather it will send that text in an HTTP response to a client. So I'm going to need to add the MVC framework because I'm going to want to show how to test controllers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the startup.cs project, or startup.cs file, and I'm going to need to add a couple of lines here. So first of all, in configure services, I'm going to add the MVC framework, the middleware, to the pipeline, and then down here in configure, I'm going to remove this call to app.run and instead tell it to use MVC. Now I've got two choices here. I can tell it to use MVC and define my own routes, or I can say use MVC with default route. And what this will do is this will be the same as saying use MVC with an explicit route with a default controller of home, a default action of ID, or index, and an optional ID. And so for simplicity, I'll just do this. So now what I have to do is I have to add the assets that this route is going to expect. So I'll go over here to the web project. I'll add a new directory, and I'm going to follow MVC convention and add a controllers folder for my controllers. And then I'm going to add a views directory for my views, and inside of there a home directory for the views for the home controller. Inside of controllers, I'll add a new file. I'll call it homecontroller.cs. In here, I'll add a namespace for the corestore.web.controllers namespace. I'll add a new class home controller, and it will derive from the base class controller, which right now the namespace for this base class has not been imported. So I'll put my cursor on top of the I'll put my cursor on top of the text with the error, and I'll press Command dot, Control dot on Windows, and that'll bring up the quick fix pop-up, and I can choose to bring in the missing namespace, and the error goes away. And now I'll just add a very simple index method here, index action method, that will return a default view. Now I need to create that view over here in the home directory. Call it index.cshtml. And for right now, just some simple markup so that we can see it working in the browser. Okay, with that, what I can do is I can switch over here to the debug panel, and I can press the run button, or I can press F5 in both Windows and Mac. And what this will do is this will build the project, start the application on localhost port 5000, launch the default browser, and go to the default page. So now we know that this is actually working. I'm going to go back over here, stop the project, and now I'm ready to write a test. Close that. So over here in the Corestore tests project, the template created a test class with a test method inside it, this unit test 1 right here. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to rename this to controller test, because again I'm going to be testing the home controller. And I'll also change the name of the class to match. And then also there's one test method already created for me. Now with XUnit, you don't have to explicitly say, hey, this class is a test class, but you do have to explicitly say that this method is a test method. And you do that with a fact attribute. And I'm going to change the name of this one to something a little bit more descriptive, which will be verify index view type. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up this test using the arrange act and assert pattern. So in the arrange step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure the preconditions for the class, or for the test. In this case, namely what I need is I just need to have an instance of a home controller. So I'll say var controller equals new home controller. I'll take care of these errors in just a minute. For the act step, what I need to do is I need to do something that will give me a result to test. So var result, and what I want to do is I want to check the type of the index view. So what I'll do is on the controller class, I'll call, or the controller instance, I'll call that index method. And then assert is where we actually check to see if what we expected to happen is what actually happened. So there's an assert class in XUnit, and there are a number of methods that I can call in this assert class to perform different types of assertions. In this case, I'm going to use one called isType. It takes a generic parameter, which is a type, view result in this case, is what I'm going to use. And then the parameter to the method itself is going to be the result. And what this will do is this will check the type of the result and compare it to view result. And if they match, then the assertion passes. But before this test can be run, I've got to fix these errors. Now this first one right here, this can be fixed just again with the quick fix. So command dot on the Mac, control dot on Windows, import the namespace. And that fixes one error, but it causes another. And that's this one right here. And this one's a little bit more, excuse my phone, and this one's a little bit more subtle. These messages right here, what they're complaining about is that the ASP.NET Core MVC libraries, the assemblies, are not in the test project, which makes sense that they wouldn't be added by default. Fortunately, again, that's easy to add. If I just go back to the terminal and go into the Core Store test project, and then what I can do is, again, using the .NET CLI, I can this time add a package, and I'm using version 2 of the .NET Core SDK, and all of the ASP.NET assemblies are in one package. It was split up into multiple packages, so I only have to import a single package now, and that's going to be Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.all. Now this is going to run, and then what's going to happen is I'm going to get a prompt to restore the packages for the project, and then after that, after a few seconds, this error with controller index should go away. Now, I've found that sometimes it seems I have to restart the editor again, so run that reload window command. This time, it didn't. Moving on, now view result. Now that we have the assemblies for our ASP.NET Core MVC, this can be resolved with the quick fix again. And that's all there is to it. So I'll save this, and now I'm ready to run this test. So there are a couple of ways that I could do this. I could, first of all, use these links that are going to be put above the test method. And there's this one here that says run test. So I'll click it, and assuming I didn't make any typos, what will happen is the project will be built, and then the test will be run, and I'll see the results. And down here, as you can see, this test passed. What I'm going to do is, just so I can see what happens when it fails, I'll change this expected type to string, which of course is wrong. Go back up here, click the run test link again, and now the test has failed. So I'll change this back to view result to prevent any problems later on. Okay, so we've written our first test. Now let's do something a little bit more involved. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a model to the Core Store web project for product data. So I'll create a folder called models. I'll put a new class in a product.cs folder. Get the namespace of corestore.web.models. Class called product. This product is just going to have a few properties on it. So I'll have an integer ID, I'll have a string which will be a name, and then I'll have a decimal which will be the price, and that'll be enough for right now. Now what I want to do is I want to create a list action inside of the home controller. And what this will do is this will just return a list of products. In a real world situation, what it would do is it would go to a database, retrieve the list of all the products in the database. But in this case, I'm just going to use, or at least to start off, I'm just going to use a static list. And list. Now what I'll do is I'll just create a static list of products. Alright, and now I need to add a corresponding view. So over here, I'll add a list view. I'll add the model declaration, which will be IEnumerable, if I can spell it correctly, IEnumerable of, and then here I'm going to have to use the fully qualified name of the model class, so corestore.web.models.product. I'll just create a little list to display them, enumerate over them in a for each. Alright, now if I didn't do anything wrong, I should be able to, by pressing F5, run the project again. Alright, now I'll go to home/list, and there we go. That's exactly what I expected to see. Alright, now I'm going to write a test for the list action method. So I'll go back to controller tests, and I'll add a new one. So I'll add my fact attribute before I forget. Public void verify list product count. And I'll start off again getting my controller. And now what I need to do is I'm going to need to get this result again. But I need the result to be as a view result because I'm going to get the model property of the view result in order to check how many items are in the model, because the model is of course a list. Now it turns out I can actually use the isType method for this again. So let me go ahead and write this. Var result equals assert.isType of view result, and then the result, and then not result, but rather controller dot list. If this assertion passes, what will happen is it will actually return the parameter to the function cast to the generic type. So in other words, now if we look over here at result, you can see the result is in fact a view result, which means that I can now get the model of that result. Now the model is just a plain old object, so I need it to be a list of product. So I'll use assert isType again to fix that for me. So now I'll say model equals assert.isType. This time I'm going to have a list. I'll need to fix this namespace of product, and I'll need to fix that namespace as well, and I'll pass it result.model. Now I can use an assert, and this time I'll use the equal method on the assert class, and all this does is just takes two values and compares them. So the expected value here is going to be 2 because I added 2 products in the action method. And here what I'll do is I'll do model.count to get the actual, and I'm going to need to import we need to bring in the link. We need to bring in the link namespace. Why is it not bringing it in? Not sure why that didn't work, but at any rate, This test is now ready to be run, so I'll run it and see what happens. Okay, and that test passed, so everything's working pretty good right now. So up to this point, I've been using a hard-coded list of data inside of the controller itself. That's obviously not real world. In a real world, it'd have a data source of some kind and would have some kind of an abstraction to talk to that data source. And this is referred to as the repository pattern sometimes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement a very simple repository here. And what I'm going to do is this is going to be interface based so that I can swap out different implementations of repositories, say between a relational database and or document DB and other different things. So back in the web project, I'll add a new directory, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this core, and inside of that I'm going to add an iProduct repository interface, and this will just define the methods that the repository is going to implement, and I'm only going to use 2 here to keep it simple. So I'll do namespace corestore.web.core. It's a little bit repetitive, but it works. And now I'll do a public interface, and I'll call it iProduct repository. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this 2 methods. The first one is going to return a list of products, and it's just going to be called list products. And I'm going to have to resolve a couple of namespaces here. Once you get the hang of using that quick fix, it's really, really fast. And then the second one is going to return a single product, and it's just going to get a single product by its ID. And it'll take an integer ID. All right, that's the product repository interface. Now I'm going to create an implementation of this interface. So again, I'll create another new folder, and this time I'll call it infrastructure. And inside of infrastructure, I will put the in-memory product repository. So I'll create the namespace for corestore.web.infrastructure. I have to be sure I spell this correctly, or it's going to cause problems later on. Then the class is going to be named in-memory product repository, and it is going to implement iProduct repository. And that's going to be in the core namespace. And then also it's still giving me an error because I have not implemented this interface completely. So if I hit the quick fix again, it will stub these methods out for me. All right, so what I'm going to do here is, since this is in memory, I'm still going to be using a static list of products, but it's going to be in a different way. That will allow us to have more flexibility with testing here in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private list of product, and call that products, and equals a new list of product. And I'll do pretty much the same thing that I did last time. Then in the getProductById method, I can just have it return from the products where, and I'm going to need to import the link namespace here. If the product query is going to check if the product pd.id is equal to the ID passed to the method, and then get the first or default. So we'll either return the first one found, which there should only be one, and if none is found, it will return null, and we'll handle that over in the action method. For list products, I'll just return the list of products up here. All right, that's going to be all we need there. And now what I'll do is I'll go back over to the home controller. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to have this home controller have a private instance of iProduct repository so that I can swap them out. So I can swap these implementations out. So what I'll do is I'll create a private iProduct repository and call it product repository. Need to bring in the namespace. And now to initialize this, I'm going to initialize this in the constructor. And I'm going to pass an object that implements iProduct repository to the constructor. So I'll use the CTOR snippet, home controller, iProduct repository, and now product repository is repository. At this point, it may look a little bit odd because how in the world is this iProduct repository getting into the constructor? And that is because of something called dependency injection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the startup CS, and up here in configure services, what I'm going to do is I'm going to register via this add scoped method. I'm going to tell what's going to happen is ASP.NET Core has dependency injection built in. So what's going to happen is I'm going to register the iProduct repository with a corresponding implementation, which is the in-memory product repository. Now, without going into too much detail, basically what this is going to do is over here in the home controller file, it's going to say, hey, the constructor here wants an instance of something that implements iProduct repository. I know, because it's registered with my dependency injection container, that in-memory product repository implements iProduct repository, so I'll just create a new in-memory product repository and pass it to the constructor. That's what's happening. So here, what I can do now is I can replace a lot of the code in this list action method with just product repository dot list products. All right. Now, at this point, we would want to test everything to make sure that our tests haven't broken, to make sure nothing's broken, but the tests are already broken. So what I could do here is I could just repository equals new in memory product repository, and explicitly, after bringing in the namespace, explicitly pass the repository to the constructor. I'll just copy this and paste it down here. Now I can run. Now I want to run both of these tests, and I can run them all at the same time by going back to the terminal and running .NET test. And this will build everything, run the tests, and we'll see if everything still passes. Everything's good, so now we're ready to continue. At this point, I've actually created another problem. Now, even though this in-memory product repository does not actually talk to a database, for a few minutes, assume that it does. What would happen if I ran this test, and inside of the product repository, when I'm trying to do some kind of data access, the database connection is dropped? The test would likely fail, but it would not be because of what I was testing. Because what I'm testing here is I'm testing the MVC application, more specifically this one action method. Database access has nothing to do with that. So what I need is I need a way to guarantee, or isolate rather, this data access logic to have a guaranteed result so that I can isolate the logic that I'm trying to test. And I can do this with something called mocking. So what will happen is I'll create a mock implementation of the interface, iProduct repository in this case, and then I will set up conditions so that specific mock object performs the exact same way, guaranteed every time. To do this, first of all, I need to add a mocking library to the test project. So again, back to the integrated terminal, .NET add package again, MOQ. Now this is pronounced mock or mock-u or whatever, but however, this needs to be added to the test project. And I need to restore the packages. Okay, now with this done, what I can do is I can begin to add in mocks here. So the first thing I'll do is, instead of having the repository up here be an in-memory repository, it's going to be a new mock, and I'm going to have to bring in the mock-u namespace of iProduct repository. And I'll need to bring in that one as well. Now, this repository is now a mock. The actual object that I pass to the home controller is represented by the object property. So what happens is you create the mock, you set it up, and then you use the object from that mock. And in this case, since I'm never calling the repository in the index method, in the index action, it doesn't matter. I just need to provide that repository. I just need to provide that mock. Even though the mock does nothing, it's okay. Because this way, I'm keeping everything lightweight. I'm reducing the chances of failure through complexity. It's really a much better way to do things. To see something that's a little bit more complex, let's go down here and look at the list action method. So first of all, I'll do a new mock iProduct repository. I'm still going to want the object here, but instead what I'm going to do is now I need to set this object up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on repository, I'm going to call this setup method. And the setup method, what this is going to do is this is going to say, given a call to list products, this object will always return a specific result. And in this case, it's just going to be a new list of product. And I'll just include in here, whoops, 2 product instances. Now, I did not populate the properties of these instances. Why? Because all I'm doing in the test is I'm checking to see the count. I'm checking to see how many are returned. I don't care what their properties are. Those are irrelevant. So this test is now ready to go. So now what I'll do is I'll go back to the integrated terminal again, and I'll run .NET test again. And everything still works. I'm going to do one last thing here, which is to create one more action method. And so I'll go over to home controller again. And this time what I'll do is I'll write action result. This will be details for a given ID. Remember, the default route that we're using has an optional ID which will be passed into this action method. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to say the product is equal to product repository, and I'm going to use that getProductById method, and I'm going to pass it the ID. Now this will either return a product or it will return null. If it returns null, in which case the product is going to be null, I'm going to return a not found view that I'll create here in a second. Else, I'll just return the default view and pass it the product. Okay, so then over here in the views, I'll first of all add this details view. Model directive with core store.web.models.product, because it's only going to be a single product this time. And I'll create another simple little list here. And I'll just give it, what I'll do is I'll just get the name, whoops, there, and then I'll get the price, convert it to a string, and I only want to have 2 decimal places. And I need to put a $sign in the front because it's currency. Then what I'll do is I'll create the not found view. Since that one's not specific to the home controller, it should go in a shared folder. And I'll just create not found. And this one's just going to have just some HTML in it. Okay, one more time. Let's run this. Index page works. Home details 1. That works. And if I go outside of the range, okay. But of course, we should be testing this with a test project. So let's go over there and do that. So I'm going to open up the controller tests again, and I'm going to write another test method. So start off with fact attribute, public void, verify that a valid ID returns a product. What I'm going to do is, just to save time, I'm going to copy this. Excuse the dog downstairs. And so this is going to start off pretty much the same, but what's going to happen here is, instead what I want to do is I want to call the getProductById method. And this is going to take a parameter of some kind. It's going to take an integer. So what I can do is I can also rely on XUnit for this. I'm going to say it is any. Actually, I'm going to say it is in range. So what this is going to do is, this is going to feed it, or it's going to check to make sure that the parameter is within a specific range of integers, with an upper bound of 1, a lower bound of 1, an upper bound of 3, and then what this is going to do is, this is going to say that the bounds are inclusive. So this is going to be 1, 2, or 3, basically. All right, now the return type is wrong because it's just going to return a new single product. And what I'll do is I'll populate that really quick. Just a static product for right now. Again, apples, and the price is $1.50. Now down here, I'm going to need to compare something different, so I'll just compare the name. And I have to also make this just a product. Okay. Now what happens, however, if I give it an invalid ID? Well, what I'll do is I'll copy this again, just for the sake of time. Verify that an invalid ID returns not found. Now, I'm going to do something, again, very, very simple here. Not totally foolproof. But first of all, what I'm going to start off is I need to modify this. And so what I'll use is I'm going to use a different method here. Just say it is an int that matches this lambda expression I'm going to give it. So give it an ID if that ID is greater than 3, because up above I defined that 1 to 3 is a valid ID, so anything above 3 is an invalid ID. And what this does is this needs to return null. Now I can't just return null. I have to return a product. So I have to take the null and cast it to a product. Now one thing that I need to do here, I forgot up here to pass an ID or call the details method. Down here I'm going to call the details method with 4 rather. And now what I need to do is I need to change this assertion to be assert.null. So I'm checking to see if the model is null. So I need to do assert.null result.model. There we go. That's what I need to do. All right, and now what I can do is I can one last time I can go over here and I can run a .NET test. All right, everything is working. So that's I've only scratched the surface of XUnit and mocking and just unit testing in general. Didn't even cover integration testing, but this is a good start. And so if you liked this video or found it helpful, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, a tweet, or something. I'll put links to the various libraries that I mentioned down in the description below, and comments and feedback are always welcome. Thanks for watching.